Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened to my parents some years ago after my siblings and I had all grown up and moved out. They were empty nesters by then, still living in the big family house where we had all been raised. The house felt different without kids in it, quieter, slower, and at night especially, it could feel almost too still. It was a normal night. Nothing unusual had happened that day. My parents had gone to bed at their usual time, the house locked up, the dogs settled. They were both fast asleep when suddenly my mom was jolted awake by a sound that immediately put her on edge. There was frantic knocking at the front door. Not a calm knock, not a doorbell. This was loud, desperate pounding. At the same time, a woman's voice was screaming through the night. "Help me! Help me! He's after me!" The dogs went absolutely insane. They were barking, growling, throwing themselves towards the front of the house. That alone was enough to spike my parents' adrenaline. The knocking continued hard and fast, like whoever it was expected the door to open immediately. My dad's first instinct was to jump out of bed and run downstairs. That's just the kind of person he is. Someone is screaming for help at your door in the middle of the night. You don't stop to think, you just react. But my mom stopped him. She told him to wait. She couldn't explain it clearly at the time, but she said something about it felt wrong, suspicious. The way the woman was screaming didn't feel natural to her. It sounded forced, almost rehearsed, like someone trying very hard to sound desperate. My mom has always had strong instincts, and in that moment, every one of them was telling her not to open the door. There was another problem too. Earlier that evening, my mom had left the entranceway light on downstairs. It was something she often did. That light illuminated the front hall and shone clearly through a large window next to the front door. From outside, anyone standing on the porch could easily see inside the house. That meant if my parents went downstairs to check the door, whoever was knocking would immediately see them. There would be no way to quietly observe the situation without being noticed. They lived on a quiet road in upstate New York, the kind of place where neighbors are spread out, where you don't expect random people to show up in the middle of the night screaming for help. That made the whole situation even stranger. The knocking and screaming continued. My dad paced at the top of the stairs, torn between wanting to help and listening to my mom's warning. The dogs were still going wild. The woman outside didn't stop. She kept shouting that someone was after her, that she needed help, that she was in danger. Then my dad had an idea. Instead of going downstairs, he decided to check from upstairs. He kept all the lights off and quietly moved from room to room on the second floor, looking out the windows that faced the front of the house. From up there, he could see the yard and the area around the porch without being seen himself. He checked the front-facing rooms first, but didn't see anything unusual beyond the woman at the door. Then he went into my old bedroom. I had the corner room of the house, which meant my windows faced not only the front yard, but also the side of the house. Almost by chance, he glanced out the side window. That's when he saw him. There was a man crouching in the bushes. He was positioned close to the house, low enough to be hidden from view unless you were looking from the right angle. He wasn't standing casually. He wasn't walking by. He was hiding, waiting. In that moment, everything clicked. The screaming woman at the door wasn't alone. My mom didn't hesitate after my dad told her what he saw. She immediately called the police. Her voice was calm but urgent. She explained that there was a woman banging on their door, claiming she was being chased, and that her husband had seen a man hiding in the bushes near the house. The police said they were on their way. Those few minutes waiting felt much longer than they actually were. The knocking continued, though it slowed down slightly. The woman didn't leave. She stayed right there, still calling out for help, still acting desperate. My parents stayed upstairs, silent, watching from the dark. When the police cars finally pulled up, everything changed very quickly. As soon as the flashing lights appeared on the road, the man in the bushes sprang up and ran out toward the street. But instead of running away in panic, he suddenly slowed down and started jogging, calmly, casually, like someone out for a late-night run. The police got out and questioned both of them. From what my parents later learned, the man insisted he was just jogging. He claimed he had nothing to do with the woman. The woman gave some explanation too, though I don't remember exactly what she said. Whatever it was apparently enough to muddy the situation. Legally, the police couldn't hold them. There was no proof of a crime. No one had broken into the house. No one had been hurt. The man claimed he was exercising. The woman claimed she was distressed for some reason. Without clear evidence, the police had to let them go. The officers did advise my parents to stay alert and to call again if anything else happened. Then they left. The house went quiet again, but the sense of unease didn't. Later that week, my parents heard something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. 2 neighborhoods over, in a different police precinct, a couple had been tied up and robbed in their own home. The details sounded horrifyingly familiar. The criminals were a pair, a man and a woman. Their method was exactly the same. The woman would go to the door late at night, screaming for help, pretending to be in danger. When the homeowners opened the door to help her, the man would appear. Together they would force their way inside, tie the people up, and rob them. Hearing that confirmed what my mom had felt that night. It had been a setup. If my parents had gone downstairs and opened the door, they would have been seen immediately through the window. The man in the bushes would have known exactly when to move. The situation could have ended very differently. The thought of that still makes my stomach turn. My parents were lucky. Lucky that my mom trusted her instincts. Lucky that my dad thought to look from upstairs. Lucky that they didn't do what most people would do and open the door without thinking twice. That story stuck with me deeply when they told me. It changed the way I think about emergencies, about strangers, about those moments where your heart tells you one thing and your instincts tell you another. Sometimes the most dangerous situations don't look dangerous at all. Sometimes they look like someone asking for help. My mom told me this story years ago, but it has never really left my mind. Even now, when I think about it, it makes me feel uneasy in a way that's hard to describe. It's one of those stories that doesn't rely on jump scares or dramatic moments. It's frightening because of how quiet it is, how ordinary it starts, and how close it comes to something unimaginably worse. My mom and I actually went to university in the same city, just many years apart. The university she attended back then was later renamed and eventually became the same university I went to. Because of that, whenever she talked about her student days, it always felt strangely familiar to me. The streets she mentioned, the neighborhoods, the types of houses students lived in, I could picture all of it clearly because I had walked those same paths myself. When my mom was a student, she lived in shared housing, like many students do. It was a typical setup, several young women living together, each with their own room, sharing common spaces like the kitchen and bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to campus, the kind of place where doors were often locked out of habit, but not because anyone truly felt unsafe. At some point during her time living there, the house started experiencing break-ins. The first time it happened, everyone was shaken, but also confused. Someone had clearly been inside the house without permission, but nothing obvious seemed to be missing. No electronics were gone, no money, no big, noticeable items. It was unsettling but also strange. Why would someone break in and take nothing? They did what anyone would do. They called the police. The police came, took statements, looked around, and asked questions. But there wasn't much they could do. There were no witnesses, no clear signs of forced entry, no DNA, no fingerprints that led anywhere useful. The police suggested better locks, being more careful, and reporting it again if it happened. And it did happen again, more than once. Each time the same pattern repeated. Someone had been in the house. Things were disturbed just enough to be noticeable, but nothing valuable was missing. Each time the police were called. Each time nothing concrete could be done. For the housemates, it became a source of anxiety. They talked about it among themselves, tried to work out what was happening, wondered if someone had a key or if they were forgetting to lock a door or window. But nothing ever made complete sense. During this time, my mom noticed something else. Some of her clothing had gone missing. Not entire outfits, not coats or shoes. Small things, personal things, underwear, items that you don't usually keep track of carefully because you assume they're somewhere in your room, in the laundry, or mixed in with other clothes. At first, she didn't think much of it. Living in shared housing, things sometimes went missing or got mixed up. She assumed one of her housemates might have borrowed something by accident or taken it without asking. Or maybe she had misplaced it herself. She didn't want to accuse anyone or make a big deal out of it, so she brushed it off. Looking back, that part is one of the most chilling details, because it wasn't random. But she didn't know that yet. Eventually, for reasons unrelated to the break-ins, my mom moved out of the house quite suddenly. It wasn't a long, planned move. It happened quickly. She packed her things and left. And her room didn't stay empty for long. Another girl moved into her room shortly afterward. What happened next is the part that still makes my stomach drop. Either the same night the new girl moved in, or the night after, someone broke into the house again. This time, it wasn't just a break-in. The girl staying in my mom's old room was raped. The attack was violent and traumatic, and it shattered any illusion that these earlier break-ins had been harmless or meaningless. The police response this time was very different. This wasn't just someone trespassing anymore. This was a serious crime, and it triggered a much larger investigation. The attacker was eventually caught. He became known as the bedsit rapist, named after the types of student accommodations he targeted. His pattern began to emerge as the investigation continued. He didn't choose his victims randomly. He stalked them. He watched them. He learned their routines. One of the key parts of his method was breaking into their homes before the attack. He would enter quietly, sometimes multiple times without being noticed. And he wouldn't steal valuables. He would steal personal items, clothing, underwear, things that gave him a sense of ownership and control over his target. When the police pieced all of this together, they realized something horrifying. My mom had been his target. A police officer contacted her directly after the arrest. They explained that based on the evidence, the missing clothing, and the pattern of break-ins, they believed he had been stalking her specifically. The earlier break-ins weren't random attempts. They were part of his process. He had been watching her, but because she moved out so suddenly, he didn't realize she was no longer living there. He came back to the house, broke in again, and assaulted the girl who had moved into her room instead. That realization is what makes this story so difficult to think about. My mom wasn't attacked, not because he wasn't planning to hurt her, but because she happened to leave at the right time. A decision that probably felt ordinary at the time ended up saving her from something life-altering or worse. At the same time, another girl suffered because of that mistake, because he didn't know his intended target was gone. There's no relief in that fact, only horror. When my mom told me this story, She didn't dramatize it. She didn't cry or raise her voice. She told it calmly, almost matter-of-factly, but I could hear the weight of it underneath her words, the knowledge that she had been watched, that someone had been inside her room, that someone had taken her clothes, that she had unknowingly lived alongside a growing threat. It still chills me when I think about how easily it could have gone unnoticed forever, how easy it was to explain away the missing items, how easy it was to assume harmless reasons, how quiet and patient the danger was. What scares me most is how normal it all felt at the time. A student house, minor break-ins, a few missing items, nothing that screamed immediate danger until it was too late for someone else. Whenever I walk through the city where we both studied, I think about that, about how thin the line is between safety and catastrophe, about how predators don't always announce themselves with violence right away. Sometimes they start by watching, by taking small things, by testing boundaries. And sometimes survival comes down to timing, chance, and a sudden change in plans. That knowledge stays with me. It always will. I was 6 years old when something happened that would shape my childhood fears for years to come, creating a phobia so deep and lasting that it affected how I felt about darkness, basements, and horror movies well into my later years. But to really understand the terror of what happened when I was 6, I need to go back a year earlier, to when I was 5 years old and experiencing what would become the foundation for one of the most frightening moments of my young life. It was late at night, well past the time when I should have been asleep in my bed. But like many children, I was still awake and wandering around the house when I probably should not have been. My mother had a friend over that evening, and they had decided to watch a movie together. Being a curious kid who did not want to miss out on anything the adults were doing, I found myself in the living room with them, though I was trying to stay hidden and unnoticed so I would not be sent back to bed. I quickly ran behind the couch when I heard them settling in to watch their movie, squeezing myself into that narrow space between the back of the furniture and the wall where kids always seem to think they are completely invisible, even when they are not. From my hiding spot, I could see the television screen and hear everything that was happening in the movie they had chosen to watch. The movie was called Mama, a horror film that probably seemed like a perfectly reasonable choice for two adults looking for some entertainment on a quiet evening at home. Now, looking back on it as an older person, Mama is not really that scary compared to a lot of other horror movies out there. It has some creepy moments and unsettling imagery, but it is not the most terrifying thing ever made. However, when you are 5 years old and watching a horror movie for essentially the first time, especially when you are watching it secretly from behind a couch late at night, the experience is completely different. At that age, you do not have the ability to separate fiction from reality the way adults do. You do not understand special effects or movie makeup, or the fact that what you are watching is just actors performing a script. Everything feels real and immediate and genuinely threatening. The movie Mama tells the story of a ghostly maternal figure who haunts and terrorizes children. And for a 5-year-old watching from behind a couch in a dark room, every scene was absolutely petrifying. The images of this supernatural entity, the way she moved, the sounds she made, the fear on the faces of the characters in the movie, all of it burned itself into my young brain with an intensity that I could not shake off even after the movie ended. I was frozen behind that couch, too scared to move or reveal myself, watching something that my mind was completely unprepared to process. When the movie finally ended and I managed to sneak back to my room, the damage had already been done. The images from Mama were stuck in my head, playing over and over again every time I closed my eyes or found myself in a dark room. That night was the first of many sleepless nights, the beginning of a period of my childhood that would be dominated by nightmares and fear. The nightmares were relentless and vivid, filled with the ghostly figure from the movie appearing in my room, in my closet, under my bed, anywhere that my terrified imagination could place her. These nightmares continued until I was 8 years old. That is 3 full years of being haunted by a movie I watched when I was 5. 3 years of being afraid to go to sleep, because I knew what kinds of dreams would be waiting for me. 3 years of waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that something from the movie was in my room with me. The fear was all-consuming and affected every aspect of my life. I did not want to be alone in any room. I needed lights on all the time. I would make excuses to avoid going into certain parts of the house where I felt the presence of that ghostly figure might be lurking. My mother probably had no idea that I had watched the movie from behind the couch that night, or if she did know, she might not have realized the profound impact it had on me. Kids are often hesitant to admit when they are scared, especially of something they were not supposed to be watching in the first place. So I carried this fear largely by myself, dealing with the nightmares and the anxiety as best as a young child could. A year after I first watched the movie, when I was 6 years old, my mother's friend came over to visit again, and this time she brought her son with her, just like before. He was 11 years old, significantly older than me, and with all the confidence and bravado that comes with being nearly a teenager. While I was settling in for the evening, he ended up in the second bed in my room, and we started talking the way kids do when they are supposed to be going to sleep but are not quite ready to yet. I told him about the movie Mama and how scary it had been for me, probably hoping for some sympathy or understanding from an older kid who might validate my fears. But he did not care at all about my terror. He was 11, and as he made sure to let me know, he had seen much scarier movies than that. To him, Mama was probably just a mildly creepy film that did not merit the kind of fear I was expressing. He could not understand, or chose not to understand, that what is scary to a 5-year-old watching a horror movie for the first time is completely different from what might scare someone who is older and more experienced with the genre. His dismissal of my fear probably stung a bit, that feeling of being made to feel silly or childish for being afraid of something that seemed so real and threatening to me. But I did not push the issue, and we eventually settled down for the night. This visit seemed like it would be unremarkable, just another evening where my mother's friend came over with her son, and nothing particularly notable happened. But then, a year later, when I was 7 years old, the friend and her son came over to visit yet again. By this point, I was still clearly and obviously scared of the movie Mama. The nightmares had continued, the fear had not diminished, and anyone who paid attention could tell that this movie had left a lasting mark on me. The friend's son, now 12 years old, was well aware of my ongoing fear because we had talked about it during previous visits and because it was probably obvious from the way I acted and the things I said. What happened next showed a level of cruelty that some older kids seem to specialize in, that particular kind of meanness that comes from knowing exactly what terrifies someone and choosing to exploit that fear for their own entertainment. He told me to go into the basement bathroom and wait there for him. I am not sure why I agreed to do this. Maybe he framed it as a game or a challenge. Maybe he said he wanted to show me something. Maybe I was just naive enough to trust that he would not do anything to hurt or scare me. Whatever the reason, I went down to the basement and into the bathroom, probably already feeling a bit uneasy because basements are inherently scary places for children, especially children who are already dealing with fears related to horror movies. I was waiting in that basement bathroom, probably wondering what was taking so long and starting to feel increasingly nervous about being down there by myself in a space that already felt creepy and isolated. The basement bathroom was likely not a very inviting place to begin with its concrete walls and dim lighting and the particular atmosphere that basement rooms always seem to have. Every sound would have seemed amplified, every shadow would have looked potentially threatening, and my imagination would have been working overtime, filling in the darkness with possibilities drawn from the nightmares that had been plaguing me for years. Before I knew what was happening, he came into the bathroom, but he was not just walking in to talk to me or to tell me the game was over. He had put on a Halloween costume, something that probably resembled or reminded me of the ghost from Mama, or was just generically scary enough to trigger all of my deepest fears. The moment I saw him in that costume, my heart must have stopped. For a split second, my terrified brain probably could not distinguish between the costume and the actual thing I had been afraid of for years. This was the nightmare becoming real, the thing I had been scared of finally appearing in front of me. Then he started screaming, adding sound to the visual horror and overwhelming my senses completely. The screaming echoed in the small bathroom space, bouncing off the hard surfaces and becoming even more disorienting and frightening. Before I could react or try to run away or do anything to protect myself, he shut off the light, plunging the bathroom into complete darkness. Suddenly I could not see anything, could not orient myself, could not tell where he was or what was happening. The darkness made everything infinitely worse, removing my ability to use my eyes to understand my surroundings and leaving me completely vulnerable. And then he grabbed me. In the pitch-black bathroom, with the echoes of his screaming still ringing in my ears and my mind reeling from the sight of him in that costume, I felt hands grabbing at me, and I completely lost any composure I had left. The combination of the costume, the screaming, the sudden darkness, and the physical grabbing was too much for my 7-year-old brain to handle. It was every nightmare I had ever had come to life all at once, concentrated into a few seconds of pure terror that felt like it would never end. I fell to the ground, my legs giving out completely as my body went into a kind of shock. I started crying, not just quiet tears, but the kind of full-body sobbing that comes from being completely overwhelmed by fear and betrayal and confusion. This was not just being scared by a movie anymore. This was being actively terrorized by someone I had trusted, someone who knew exactly how afraid I was and had chosen to weaponize that fear against me in the cruelest way possible. This moment in that basement bathroom became the scariest thing I had ever experienced up to that point in my life, surpassing even the original viewing of the movie that had started all of this. The movie had been frightening because of what I saw on a screen, but this was real. This was happening to me in my own house, perpetrated by someone who I thought was at least somewhat of a friend, or at least someone who would not hurt me. The betrayal and the fear combined into something that went beyond what a horror movie could ever accomplish. The aftermath of this incident was probably chaotic. My mother and her friend must have heard my crying and come down to the basement to find out what had happened. There would have been explanations and apologies, probably some anger directed at the boy who had done this to me, and attempts to comfort me and calm me down. But no amount of explanation or apology could undo what had just happened, or erase the memory of those few terrifying moments in the dark bathroom. This experience likely extended and intensified the nightmares that I had already been dealing with for years. Now I had a new traumatic memory to add to the collection, a real-life event that proved that the scary things could jump out of the screen and into my actual life. The basement bathroom probably became a place I refused to go into for a long time afterward. The trust I had in older kids, or at least in that particular older kid, was completely shattered. Looking back on it now as an adult, I can see the incident for what it was. A mean prank pulled by a kid who was old enough to know better, but not mature enough to understand the real impact his actions would have. He probably thought it was funny. or that it would be a harmless scare that I would get over quickly. He might not have realized or cared about the fact that I had been dealing with genuine trauma related to that movie for years, and that what he was doing was not just a simple jump scare, but a deliberate exploitation of a deep-seated fear that had been affecting my life since I was 5 years old. But in the moment, and for years afterward, there was no adult perspective to provide context or minimize the fear. There was just the memory of being trapped in a dark bathroom with someone screaming and grabbing at me while wearing a costume that represented everything I had been afraid of for years. That memory became one of those defining moments of childhood, the kind of thing that shapes how you see the world and how you respond to fear. The incident probably affected my relationship with that boy as well. I doubt I ever fully trusted him again after that, and I probably dreaded seeing him whenever my mother's friend came to visit. What had maybe been a neutral or even friendly relationship before became something tainted by the memory of what he had done to me in that basement bathroom. He had proven himself capable of cruelty, of taking pleasure in my fear, and that is not something a child easily forgets or forgives. For my mother and her friend, this incident probably created some awkwardness in their relationship as well. How do you maintain a friendship when one person's child has deliberately terrorized the other person's child? There would have been difficult conversations, expectations that the boy would apologize or be punished in some way, and a lingering tension around the question of whether he truly understood how wrong his actions had been. The experience also taught me some unfortunate lessons about vulnerability and trust. I learned that sharing your fears with others, especially with older kids who might not take them seriously, can open you up to being exploited and hurt. I learned that not everyone will respect your feelings or care about your emotional well-being. I learned that sometimes the people who should know better will choose to be cruel anyway. These are harsh lessons for a 7-year-old to learn, and they probably made me more guarded and less willing to open up about my fears going forward. The nightmares related to the movie Mama eventually did fade as I got older, and my brain developed better tools for processing and contextualizing fear. By the time I was 8 or 9, the images from the movie no longer had the same power over me that they had when I was younger. But the memory of what happened in that basement bathroom never lost its edge. It remained sharp and vivid, a reminder of a time when I was vulnerable and someone chose to take advantage of that vulnerability in the worst possible way. Now, looking back on the whole experience from the perspective of someone much older, I can see the entire arc of what happened. It started with a 5-year-old secretly watching a movie from behind a couch, led to years of nightmares and fear, and culminated in a cruel prank that magnified all of that existing terror into a concentrated moment of horror. It is a story about childhood fear, about the lasting impact that scary media can have on young minds, and about how trust can be violated and trauma can be compounded by the thoughtless or malicious actions of others. The boy who did this to me probably does not think about it much now, if he even remembers it at all. For him, it was likely just one prank among many, a moment of entertainment that he moved on from immediately. But for me, it remained one of the most frightening experiences of my childhood, a memory that I can still recall with perfect clarity even though so many years have passed. That is often how these things work. The perpetrator forgets while the victim remembers, carrying the weight of the experience long after the person who caused it has moved on to other things. The basement bathroom where it happened probably still exists, maybe in the same house, or maybe not if my family moved at some point. But whether or not the physical space still exists, it exists permanently in my memory as the site of that terrifying moment. Every detail is still there. The feel of the floor when I fell, the sound of the screaming echoing off the walls, the absolute darkness when the light went out. The sensation of being grabbed and not knowing what was happening or how to make it stop. These sensory memories remain vivid and accessible, testament to how deeply fear can carve itself into our minds when we are young and vulnerable. When I was younger, a small girl went missing from my aunt's neighborhood, and the entire community was thrown into a state of panic and grief that I will never forget. It was the kind of event that changes a place forever, that makes parents hold their children a little tighter, and makes everyone look at their neighbors with new suspicion and fear. The disappearance of a child is every parent's worst nightmare. And when it happens in your own neighborhood, in a place you thought was safe, it shatters the sense of security that people rely on to get through their daily lives. The girl had been playing at the local park, just doing what kids do on any normal day. Parks are supposed to be safe places where children can run and play and be kids, where parents can relax a little and let their children have some freedom and independence. But on this particular day, something went horribly wrong. The girl was there one moment playing on the swings or the slide or chasing friends around the playground, and then she was simply gone. No one saw exactly what happened, or if they did see something, they did not realize at the time that they were witnessing a kidnapping. Maybe they saw a man talking to a little girl and assumed it was her father or uncle. Maybe they saw a child getting into a car and thought it was a normal pickup by a family member. Or maybe the kidnapper was careful and waited for a moment when no one was watching, when the girl had wandered slightly away from the other children, or when the adults supervising had their attention elsewhere for just a few crucial seconds. When the girl did not come home that evening, her parents knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Children that age do not just wander off for hours without telling anyone. They do not forget to come home for dinner or lose track of time to that extent. The parents called friends and neighbors, checked with other families whose children had been at the park, drove around the neighborhood looking for any sign of her. When none of these efforts produced results, they called the police and reported their daughter missing. The police response to a missing child is always swift and comprehensive. Officers began searching the area around the park, going door to door to ask if anyone had seen anything, checking with local businesses to see if their security cameras had captured any useful footage. Search parties were organized with volunteers from the community, people who wanted to help in any way they could. Flyers were printed with the girl's photo and description, offering a reward for information and begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. The local news picked up the story, broadcasting the girl's picture and the circumstances of her disappearance to a wider audience. The search went on for about 2 weeks, 14 agonizing days during which her parents and the entire community held on to hope that she might still be found alive. Every day that passed made that hope a little harder to maintain, but no one wanted to give up or admit the possibility that she might already be dead. Parents in the neighborhood kept their children close, no longer allowing them to play outside unsupervised, walking them to and from school, checking on them constantly. The carefree atmosphere that had existed before was replaced with fear and vigilance, with everyone looking over their shoulders and suspecting strangers. During those 2 weeks of searching, the person who had taken the girl was living with a terrible secret. He had kidnapped her from the park, and at some point shortly after taking her, he had killed her. The reasons why are impossible for any normal person to understand. What drives someone to harm a child, to take a young life that has barely begun, to destroy a family and traumatize a community? There are no good answers to these questions, only the terrible reality that such people exist and that they sometimes act on their darkest impulses. After killing the girl, The kidnapper did something that was both horrifying and calculated. He chopped up her body into pieces, a gruesome act that shows a level of cold-bloodedness and detachment from normal human empathy that is almost impossible to comprehend. This was not a crime of passion or an accident that spiraled out of control. This was methodical and deliberate, the actions of someone who was thinking about how to avoid getting caught, rather than being consumed by guilt or remorse for what he had done. He then kept the pieces of her body in his freezer for those 2 weeks while the search was going on all around him. Imagine the psychological state of someone who could do that, who could go about their daily life with the remains of a murdered child stored in their home like so much frozen meat. He would have seen the news reports about the missing girl, would have known that her parents were desperately searching for her, would have been aware of the community's fear and grief, and through it all, he kept his secret, maintaining a normal facade while hiding evidence of his terrible crime in his freezer. Eventually, he decided that he needed to dispose of the body. Keeping it indefinitely would be too risky, too likely to be discovered if anyone ever had reason to search his home. So he came up with a plan that he apparently thought was clever, but that turned out to be incredibly stupid and careless. He put the pieces of the girl's body into black garbage bags, the same kind of bags that people use for regular household trash. Then he placed these bags next to the regular trash bags that were set out for collection, apparently believing that the garbage men would simply pick them up along with everything else and take them to the landfill, where they would be buried and never found. This plan showed a fundamental lack of understanding about how trash collection works and how human remains behave. Bodies, even when frozen and chopped up, have a distinct and unmistakable smell as they begin to decompose. The freezing had preserved the remains to some extent, but once they were removed from the freezer and left out in garbage bags, especially if the weather was warm, decomposition would begin relatively quickly, and the smell of decomposing human remains is something that people notice and recognize, even if they have never encountered it before. It is not a smell that can be easily mistaken for regular garbage or ignored. The bags were discovered not by the garbage men, but by a maid or cleaning person who was working in the area. She noticed a weird smell coming from the bags, something that immediately struck her as wrong and concerning. Instead of just ignoring it or assuming it was just particularly nasty trash, she decided to investigate. Maybe she had a strong sense of intuition that told her this was something more serious than ordinary garbage. Maybe the smell was so bad that she felt she needed to identify the source before it got worse. Or maybe she had been following the news about the missing girl, and some instinct told her that these bags might be connected to that case. When she checked the bags and saw what was inside, the horror and shock must have been overwhelming. She had stumbled upon the remains of a murdered child, the little girl that the entire community had been searching for. The discovery answered the terrible question of what had happened to her, but it also confirmed everyone's worst fears. The girl was not going to be found alive and returned to her family. She had been murdered and dismembered, treated with a level of cruelty and disrespect that no human being, let alone a child, should ever experience. The police were called immediately, and the scene was secured as a crime scene. Forensic investigators would have carefully documented everything, collecting the bags as evidence, photographing the location, interviewing the person who found them, and anyone else who might have seen something relevant. The bags and their contents would have been taken to the medical examiner's office for analysis, to confirm the identity of the victim and to look for any evidence that might point to who had killed her. The news that the girl's body had been found spread through the community quickly, bringing a wave of grief and horror that replaced the anxious hope that people had been clinging to. Parents had to explain to their children what had happened. had to find words to describe something that should never happen and that no child should have to know about. The girl's family had to confront the reality that their daughter was never coming home, that she had died in a terrible way, and that they would never get to see her grow up or achieve any of the dreams and possibilities that her young life had held. The investigation into who had killed her would have intensified at this point. The location where the bags were found would provide clues about who had placed them there. Were there security cameras in the area that might have captured someone putting the bags out? Were there fingerprints or DNA on the bags that could be matched to a suspect? The fact that the body had been kept in a freezer suggested that the killer had access to a residence or business with freezer space, which might help narrow down the list of possible suspects. But despite what should have been strong leads and an intensive investigation, I do not think the person who did this was ever caught. This is one of the most frustrating and tragic aspects of the whole terrible story. Someone got away with murdering a child, with taking a young life and destroying a family, and they have never been held accountable for what they did. They might still be living in the same area, walking the same streets, maybe even having normal interactions with people who have no idea what they did. Or they might have moved away, started a new life somewhere else, carrying the secret of their crime with them. The failure to catch the killer would have left the community with a lingering sense of unease and unfinished business. There was no trial where justice could be seen to be done, no conviction that would at least provide some closure and confirmation that the person responsible was being punished. The fear that the killer was still out there, possibly living among them, would have been a constant source of anxiety. Parents would wonder if their children were safe, if the person who had killed once might do it again, if there was some way to identify and avoid the danger that had already struck once. After the girl's body was found and the reality of what had happened became clear, life in my aunt's neighborhood changed significantly. I was not allowed out in her neighborhood after dark for a while, and I am sure many other children faced similar restrictions from their parents. The freedom and innocence that children had enjoyed before, the ability to play outside without constant supervision, was replaced with rules and limitations designed to keep them safe. Parents became more protective, more suspicious of strangers, more aware of the potential dangers that existed in the world. The park where the girl had been kidnapped probably became a different place after that tragedy. Parents might have avoided taking their children there, or if they did go, they would have watched their kids with hawk-like intensity, never letting them out of sight even for a moment. The playground equipment and open spaces that were meant to be places of joy and childhood fun became instead a reminder of what had been lost and what could happen when vigilance was relaxed even briefly. For the girl's family, the pain and loss were unimaginable and permanent. They had to bury their daughter, had to live with the knowledge of how she died and what had been done to her body, had to face every holiday and birthday and milestone with the aching absence of the child who should have been there. The lack of justice, the fact that no one was ever caught and punished for taking their daughter's life, would have been an additional burden to carry alongside their grief. The community as a whole was traumatized by what had happened. This was not something that happened in big cities or dangerous neighborhoods. This was a local park in an area where people thought they were safe, where children should have been able to play without fear. The randomness and senselessness of the crime made it even more frightening. There was no way to predict it or prevent it, no clear pattern that could be studied and avoided. It was just a terrible thing that happened to an innocent child who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Years later, the case probably remains officially open, sitting in some cold case file waiting for new evidence or a confession that might never come. Advances in forensic technology might offer new possibilities for solving old crimes, and there is always a chance that DNA evidence that was collected but could not be analyzed at the time might yield results with newer techniques. But for many cold cases, especially those that are decades old, the chances of resolution grow slimmer with each passing year. The story serves as a grim reminder of the importance of staying vigilant and aware, of teaching children about safety without robbing them of their childhood innocence, of building communities where people look out for each other and report suspicious behavior. It shows how quickly tragedy can strike and how profoundly it can affect everyone involved, from the immediate family to the wider community, to children like me who were growing up in the shadow of this terrible event. I think about that little girl sometimes, wondering what kind of person she would have grown up to be if she had been given the chance. I think about her parents and family members carrying their grief through the years, never getting the justice or closure they deserved. And I think about the person who did this, who took a child's life and got away with it. And I wonder if they ever feel remorse, or if they have managed to completely suppress what they did and move on with their life as if nothing happened. The neighborhood where my aunt lives eventually returned to something resembling normal life, but the memory of what happened never completely faded. Parents still tell their children to be careful, still hold their hands a little tighter in public places, still feel a flutter of fear when a child is a few minutes late coming home. The tragedy became part of the neighborhood's history, a dark chapter that people remember and that shapes how they think about safety and community and the fragility of the things we take for granted. For me personally, the event had a lasting impact on how I viewed the world. I learned at a young age that terrible things can happen anywhere, that danger does not always announce itself clearly, and that not all stories have happy endings or justice being served. The restrictions placed on me after the girl's body was found, not being allowed out after dark in my aunt's neighborhood, were frustrating at the time but made sense in the context of a community trying to protect its children from an unknown threat. The fact that the killer was never caught means that somewhere, someone knows what happened. Either the killer himself carries that knowledge, or perhaps someone close to him noticed something suspicious and chose to remain silent. The burden of that secret, whether carried by one person or shared by multiple people who suspected but said nothing, is a heavy one. The truth about what happened to that little girl, the full details of how she was taken and killed and why, may never be fully known. And that uncertainty, that lack of resolution, is yet another tragedy layered on top of the loss of a young life. The black garbage bags that were found by the maid that day became evidence in an unsolved crime, physical proof of a terrible act, but not enough to lead to an arrest and conviction. They represented both the brutality of what had been done and the carelessness of someone who thought they could dispose of a human being like ordinary trash. The smell that led to their discovery was the final indignity suffered by the victim, but it was also what brought the truth to light and at least gave the family the ability to lay their daughter to rest properly. This story, like too many others, remains unfinished. The questions outnumber the answers. The pain continues long after the immediate crisis has passed, and justice remains elusive. But the memory of what happened and the impact it had on everyone involved serves as a reminder of why we must protect the vulnerable, why we must remain vigilant, and why we must never give up seeking justice for victims, even when the path forward seems impossible. In Poland, there were about 10 German soldiers who found themselves in one of the most horrific situations imaginable during the aftermath of World War II. These men became trapped inside a bunker after it was bombed, sealed off from the outside world, in what would become their prison and their tomb for an unbelievable length of time. The bunker that had been designed to protect them from enemy fire instead became a dark, underground hell, where they would spend years of their lives slowly withering away, cut off from sunlight, fresh air, and any connection to the world above them. When the bombing occurred, it must have been absolutely catastrophic. The structure of the bunker was damaged in such a way that the exits became completely blocked, tons of rubble and earth sealing the men inside, with no way to dig themselves out. In those first hours and days after the collapse, they probably tried everything they could think of to escape. They would have clawed at the debris, attempted to move the massive chunks of concrete and earth that stood between them and freedom, shouted for help in the desperate hope that someone might hear them and come to their rescue. But their efforts were futile. The damage was too extensive, the debris too heavy, and perhaps most devastating of all, there was no one coming to look for them. The war had ended, or was ending, and in the chaos of those final days and the immediate aftermath, entire units were lost or forgotten. Communication lines had broken down, records had been destroyed, and armies were in full retreat or dissolution. The exact location of every bunker and every soldier was not tracked with the kind of precision that might have led to a rescue effort. These men simply vanished from the official record, trapped beneath the earth while the world moved on without them. At first, the soldiers would have had some hope of rescue. They probably believed that it was only a matter of time before someone would dig them out, that their absence would be noticed and a search would be mounted. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months with no sign of rescue, that hope would have slowly begun to fade. They were forced to confront the terrible reality that they might be down there for a very long time, that they might have to find a way to survive in this underground prison with only the limited resources available to them. Food became their most critical concern. The bunker would have had some supplies stored, military rations that were meant to sustain the soldiers during their duty shifts. But these supplies were never intended to last for years. The men had to begin rationing immediately, dividing up what they had and restricting themselves to the bare minimum needed to stay alive. Every bite of food had to be carefully considered, every morsel saved and stretched as far as it would go. They probably created a system for distributing the rations fairly, knowing that their survival depended on cooperation and careful management of their dwindling resources. But even with the strictest rationing, the stored food eventually ran out. When that happened, the soldiers were forced to turn to the only other source of protein available to them in their underground prison. Rats had found their way into the bunker, probably through cracks and small openings that were too small for a man to escape through, but large enough for rodents to squeeze through. These rats became the soldiers' primary food source, a grim necessity that they had to overcome their revulsion to accept. They would have had to catch the rats, kill them, and prepare them in whatever way they could manage with the limited tools and fuel they had available. The psychological barrier of eating rats, creatures that are associated with disease and filth, must have been enormous to overcome. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and survival instinct eventually overrides disgust. Water was another critical resource. Bunkers were typically designed with some water storage or access to groundwater, but maintaining a clean water supply in those conditions would have been incredibly difficult. They would have had to be extremely careful about contamination, about rationing their water consumption, about keeping their drinking water separate from waste. The management of basic human needs, like drinking, sanitation, and hygiene, in a sealed underground space with no ventilation or drainage, would have been a constant challenge and source of disease. As the years dragged on, the conditions in the bunker became increasingly unbearable. The air quality would have deteriorated, becoming stale and oxygen poor as the ventilation systems failed or became blocked. The darkness would have been almost total. with whatever lights or candles they had eventually burning out, leaving them in perpetual blackness. The psychological impact of living in complete darkness for years on end, never seeing the sun or the sky, never experiencing the passage of day and night, would have been devastating to their mental health. The soldiers began to die one by one, victims of disease, malnutrition, and the horrific conditions they were living in. Without proper medical care or medicine, even minor illnesses or injuries could become fatal. Infections would have spread in the unsanitary conditions. Weakened immune systems would have been unable to fight off diseases, and the chronic malnutrition would have made their bodies increasingly fragile and unable to heal. Each death would have been a terrible blow to the survivors, not just emotionally, but also practically, as it meant one less person to share the work of survival and one more body to deal with in their confined space. Some of the soldiers could not bear the suffering any longer and chose to end their own lives. The psychological torment of being trapped underground for years, watching their comrades die, living in darkness and filth, eating rats and slowly starving, would have pushed some of them beyond their ability to endure. Suicide became an escape from a situation that seemed to have no other exit, a way to control at least the manner and timing of their death when everything else had been taken from their control. The survivors would have had to witness these suicides, would have had to live with the bodies of their comrades who had chosen death over continued suffering. Eventually, there were only 2 soldiers left alive in that bunker, 2 men who had somehow managed to survive when all the others had died, who had endured years of unimaginable hardship and were still clinging to life despite having every reason to give up. These final 2 survivors must have developed a deep bond forged through shared trauma, relying on each other for company and motivation to keep going even when there seemed to be no point in continuing to survive. After what I initially believed was about 15 years trapped underground, though research suggests it may have actually been closer to 6 years with around 5 soldiers initially trapped, the bunker was finally discovered and opened. Someone, somehow, found the buried bunker and began the process of excavating it and breaking through the debris that had sealed it shut for so long. The rescue effort must have been difficult and time-consuming, carefully removing rubble and earth while trying not to cause further collapse or injury to anyone who might still be alive inside. When the bunker was finally opened and light from the outside world flooded in for the first time in years, one of the 2 remaining soldiers died almost immediately. After spending so long in complete darkness, his eyes and his system could not handle the sudden exposure to bright light. The shock of it, both physical and psychological, was too much for his weakened body to handle. He had survived years of unimaginable hardship, had made it through disease and starvation and despair, had outlasted nearly all of his comrades, only to die at the moment of rescue because his body could no longer process normal sensory input. The tragedy of this death, coming so close to freedom and safety, is almost unbearable to contemplate. The last surviving soldier, the final man left alive from the original group that had been trapped, was in a condition that shocked the rescuers. He had a beard that had grown all the way down to his toes, years of unchecked growth in the darkness of the bunker, creating a mass of hair that covered much of his body. This detail, more than almost anything else, illustrates just how long these men had been trapped and how completely cut off from normal life they had been. He was also partially blind, his eyes damaged by the years spent in darkness and possibly by malnutrition and disease. His body would have been emaciated, his muscles wasted from lack of proper nutrition and the confined space that prevented normal movement. The psychological state of this final survivor is difficult to imagine. He had watched all of his comrades die, had spent years in darkness eating rats and rationing scraps, had lost track of time and possibly of his own identity. The world he emerged into would have been completely different from the one he had left. The war was over. Germany had been defeated and divided. The political landscape of Europe had been completely transformed. Everyone he had known might be dead or scattered. His home might no longer exist, and he himself had been presumed dead for years. The question of why it took so long for the bunker to be discovered is troubling. Were there no searches conducted for missing soldiers? Did the bombing damage disguise the bunker so well that no one realized there was a structure beneath the rubble? Was the area simply abandoned after the war, with no one having reason to excavate or investigate? The fact that these men could be trapped for years without anyone finding them speaks to the chaos and devastation of the war's end, to the enormous number of casualties and missing persons that overwhelmed any ability to account for everyone. When this story came to light, it must have shocked the world. The idea that soldiers had survived for years in such conditions, that they had been forgotten and left to die slowly in an underground tomb, would have been horrifying to contemplate. It raised questions about the duty of care owed to soldiers, about the failures of military bureaucracy that allowed men to be lost and forgotten, about the resilience of human beings in the face of unimaginable suffering. The survivor who made it out of the bunker alive would have faced an incredibly difficult process of rehabilitation and reintegration. His body would have needed extensive medical care to recover from years of malnutrition and disease. His eyes would have needed treatment and protection as they slowly adjusted to light again after so long in darkness. His beard would have been cut, his body washed and cared for, his physical wounds treated as best they could be, but the psychological scars from his experience would have been much harder to address. How do you return to normal life after spending years trapped underground watching your friends die? How do you sleep in a regular bed under an open sky when you have spent so long in a dark, confined bunker? How do you eat normal food when you have survived on rats for years? How do you trust that the nightmare is really over and that you are not going to wake up back in that darkness? The trauma of such an experience would be profound and lasting, likely affecting every aspect of the survivor's remaining life. The story also raises questions about the other soldiers who died in that bunker. Did they have families who never knew what happened to them? Were they listed as missing in action, leaving their loved ones to wonder for years whether they might still be alive somewhere? When the bunker was finally opened and the bodies were discovered, were families finally able to get closure and know what had happened to their sons or husbands or fathers? The bureaucratic process of identifying remains and notifying next of kin would have been complicated by the condition of the bodies and the passage of so much time. After doing some research into this story, it appears that the details may not be quite as extreme as initially believed. Rather than 10 soldiers trapped for 15 years, it seems it was more like 5 soldiers trapped for 6 years. But even these revised numbers represent an almost unimaginable ordeal. 6 years trapped underground is still an eternity. Still more than enough time for multiple people to die of disease and starvation. Still long enough to grow a beard to your toes and lose your vision in the darkness. The specific numbers matter less than the fundamental horror of the situation these men endured. The story serves as a reminder of the countless individual tragedies that made up World War II, the personal hells that individual soldiers experienced beyond the large-scale battles and campaigns that dominate the history books. While generals were making strategic decisions and nations were negotiating treaties, these men were trapped in the dark eating rats and watching each other die. Their suffering was unknown to the world, unrecorded in the official histories, forgotten by everyone except themselves. It also illustrates the sometimes arbitrary nature of survival in extreme circumstances. Why did 1 or 2 men survive when all the others died? Was it physical constitution, mental fortitude, luck, or some combination of all three? The survivors were not necessarily stronger or smarter or more deserving than those who died. They simply happened to be the ones whose bodies and minds held out long enough to still be alive when rescue finally came. And in a cruel twist, one of them survived the bunker, only to die from the shock of rescue itself, his body unable to process the return to normal conditions after adapting for so long to the abnormal. The image of that final survivor, with his beard grown to his toes, partially blind, emerging from the bunker after years in darkness, is one that captures the imagination and breaks the heart. He represents both the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the terrible cost of survival in impossible circumstances. He lived through something that no one should ever have to experience, bore witness to deaths and suffering that will haunt anyone who hears about them, and emerged into a world that had moved on without him. What happened to this final survivor after his rescue is unclear from the available information. Did he ever fully recover physically? Was he able to rebuild any kind of normal life? Did he have family or friends still alive to return to? Did he receive the medical and psychological care he needed? Did he ever speak publicly about his experience? Or did he choose to remain silent about the horrors he had witnessed and endured? These questions remain unanswered, adding to the mystery and tragedy of an already devastating story. The bunker itself, once opened and its grim contents revealed, would have stood as a testament to the suffering that had occurred there. Whether it was preserved as a memorial or demolished and forgotten is unknown, but the memory of what happened in that underground space should not be lost. It is part of the larger story of World War II, a war that claimed tens of millions of lives and created countless individual tragedies like this one. These soldiers deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or casualties of war, but as human beings who suffered terribly and died alone in the dark, far from home and forgotten by the world they had been sent to fight for. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. Years ago, my grandmother's brother passed away, but not in any way that anyone could have anticipated or prepared for. His death came in a horrible accident that has haunted our family ever since, not just because we lost someone we loved, but because of how random and preventable it seemed. He was doing such a basic daily thing that you would not really expect death from, which is what makes it so scary to me and to everyone who heard about what happened. The ordinariness of the activity, combined with the extraordinary and tragic outcome, creates a kind of fear that is hard to shake, because it reminds us that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. He had gone fishing that day, an activity he had probably done hundreds or even thousands of times before throughout his life. Fishing is one of those peaceful, relaxing hobbies that people take up precisely because it feels safe and calm. You sit by the water, cast your line, wait patiently for a bite, and enjoy the quiet and the connection with nature. It is not supposed to be dangerous. It is not an extreme sport or a high-risk activity. It is fishing, something that grandparents do with their grandchildren, something that people do to unwind and escape from stress, something that represents simplicity and peace rather than danger and death. On this particular day, he was probably looking forward to a few hours of relaxation and solitude, or maybe he was fishing with friends or family members who shared his love of the sport. He would have prepared his equipment, gathered his tackle box and rod, chosen his spot by the water, and settled in for what should have been an unremarkable and pleasant afternoon. The weather was probably nice, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be outside and alive. There was no reason to think that anything was wrong or that this day would be any different from all the other times he had gone fishing, but something terrible was hidden beneath the surface of the water where he was fishing, something that he had no way of knowing about or avoiding. When he cast his fishing rod out into the water, the line or the rod itself somehow caught onto a big electrical wire that was underwater. This should not have been there. Electrical wires are not supposed to be running through bodies of water where people fish and swim and boat. But somehow, whether through faulty infrastructure, illegal dumping, an accident, or neglect, this wire was there, live and dangerous, waiting to kill someone. The moment his fishing rod made contact with that electrical wire, a massive amount of electricity would have surged through the rod and into his body. Fishing rods, especially older ones or those made with certain materials, can conduct electricity extremely well. The water would have made the situation even more deadly, as water is an excellent conductor of electricity. The shock would have been instant and devastating, sending thousands of volts through his system before he even had time to realize what was happening or let go of the rod. Electrocution is a horrible way to die. The electrical current disrupts the normal functioning of the heart and the nervous system, causing the muscles to seize up and contract involuntarily. The victim often cannot let go of whatever is conducting the electricity because their muscles have locked in place. The heart goes into an irregular rhythm or stops beating altogether. Burns form at the points where the electricity enters and exits the body. The pain for the brief moment before consciousness is lost must be excruciating and overwhelming. But the electrocution was not the only thing that happened to him. The shock also caused him to fall into the water, either because he lost consciousness, or because the muscle contractions threw him off balance, or because his body simply gave out under the assault of the electrical current. So now he was not only being electrocuted, but he was also underwater, unable to breathe, unable to swim to safety, unable to call for help. The combination of electrocution and drowning created a situation where survival was virtually impossible. If there were other people around when this happened, they would have been faced with an impossible situation. How do you help someone who is being electrocuted in the water? If you jump in to try to save them, you will likely be electrocuted as well because the water is conducting the electricity in all directions from the source. The proper response is to try to cut off the power source first, but in a situation like this, where the electrical wire is underwater and its location is unknown, that is not something that can be done quickly or easily, so people might have been forced to watch helplessly as he died, knowing that trying to save him would only result in more deaths. The emergency response would have been called. Of course, paramedics and possibly fire department rescue teams would have rushed to the scene, but by the time they arrived and were able to safely remove him from the water and assess the situation, it was probably already too late. Even if they managed to pull him out and attempt resuscitation, the damage from the electrocution and the time spent underwater without oxygen would have been too severe. His heart might have been restarted temporarily, but the injuries to his brain and other organs from lack of oxygen and from the electrical burns would have been catastrophic. The absolute worst thing about this tragedy, the detail that makes it almost unbearably cruel, is that this man had beaten cancer twice before this happened. Twice he had been diagnosed with a disease that kills millions of people every year. Twice he had gone through the grueling treatments, the chemotherapy or radiation or surgery or whatever combination of therapies were required for his particular type of cancer. Twice he had endured the nausea, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty of not knowing whether the treatment would work or whether the cancer would come back. Twice he had fought his way through to remission, had celebrated surviving something that many people do not survive. had been given a second and then a third chance at life. Cancer is one of the most feared diagnoses a person can receive. The treatments are brutal, often making patients feel worse before they feel better, if they feel better at all. The recovery process is long and difficult, requiring tremendous physical and emotional strength. Many people do not survive their first bout with cancer, let alone come back from it twice. The fact that he had done this, had proven himself to be a fighter and a survivor, had overcome such tremendous odds, only to die in a random fishing accident feels cosmically unfair. He had proven that he could beat the biggest, scariest challenge that life threw at him. He had looked death in the face multiple times and refused to give in. He had done everything right, followed his treatment plans, stayed positive, fought hard, and won. And his reward for all that strength and perseverance was to die doing something completely ordinary and safe, killed by a hazard that should never have been there in the first place, in a way that was so obscure and unlikely that no one could have predicted it or warned him about it. This is what makes his death so deeply unsettling and frightening to think about. If he could survive cancer twice but die fishing, what does that say about our ability to control our own fate? What does it mean about safety and risk and the illusion of security that we all rely on to function in daily life? We can protect ourselves against known dangers, can make smart choices about our health and safety, can fight against diseases and injuries with modern medicine and determination. But how do you protect yourself against underwater electrical wires that you do not know are there? How do you prepare for dangers that are completely invisible and unexpected? The randomness and absurdity of it is almost too much to process. If you asked 100 people to list the dangers associated with fishing, electrocution by underwater electrical wire would probably not appear on anyone's list. Drowning, maybe. Or getting a hook stuck in your hand. Or sunburn, or a boat capsizing. But electrocution from submerged power lines, that is so far outside the realm of normal expectations that it seems almost impossible, like something from a dark comedy sketch rather than real life. For our family, the grief was complicated by the senselessness of it all. When someone dies of cancer, as terrible as that is, there is at least a narrative that makes sense. Cancer is a known killer, a disease that we understand even if we cannot always defeat it. There is a logic to it, a cause and effect that fits into our understanding of how the world works. But this death defied logic and understanding. It was a freak accident, an impossible convergence of circumstances that should never have occurred. My grandmother, who had just lost her brother, had to grapple with the reality that he had survived so much only to be taken by something so mundane. She had probably worried about him during his cancer treatments, had feared that she might lose him to the disease, had celebrated with him when he went into remission. And now she had to mourn him anyway, but for completely different and utterly unexpected reasons. The grief would have been mixed with anger at the unfairness of it all, at the cruel irony of his survival and then sudden death. The investigation into what happened would have tried to determine how and why there was a live electrical wire in the water where he was fishing. Was it from a nearby power line that had fallen into the water? Was it from some kind of underwater electrical equipment that had malfunctioned? Was it the result of illegal or improper electrical work done near the water? Who was responsible for this hazard existing in the first place, and why had it not been detected and removed before it could kill someone? These questions matter not just for assigning blame, but for preventing future deaths. If there was negligence involved, if some individual or company or government agency failed to properly maintain infrastructure or enforce safety regulations, then they should be held accountable. More importantly, steps should be taken to ensure that this specific hazard is removed and that similar hazards elsewhere are identified and eliminated. One death is already too many, but it becomes even more tragic if nothing is learned from it and the same thing happens to someone else. The location where the accident occurred probably became a place that our family could never look at the same way again. What had been a peaceful fishing spot, maybe somewhere he had gone for years without incident, was now the site of a tragedy. Other people might still fish there, unaware of what happened or choosing to believe that lightning does not strike twice in the same place. But for our family, that location would forever be associated with loss and the terrible randomness of death. The fact that this happened only 2 years ago means that the grief is still relatively fresh and raw. 2 years is not very long when it comes to processing the death of a loved one, especially when that death was so sudden and unexpected. The family is probably still working through the stages of grief, still having moments where the reality of his absence hits them all over again, still wondering what if and why and how this could have happened. For me personally, hearing about how he died has changed the way I think about everyday activities and hidden dangers. I find myself being more cautious around water, more aware of the infrastructure around me, more conscious of the fact that safety is sometimes an illusion and that terrible things can happen when we least expect them. It is not that I live in constant fear or paranoia, but there is now a background awareness that the world contains dangers that we cannot always see or predict. The story also makes me think about the value of the time we have and the importance of not taking anything for granted. He beat cancer twice, which should have meant he had many more years ahead of him. But those years were stolen by a random accident that no one could have foreseen. It is a reminder that we should appreciate the people we love while we have them, that we should not assume there will always be more time for the conversations we want to have or the experiences we want to share. His death also raises questions about infrastructure safety and public responsibility. Bodies of water where people fish and swim and recreate should be safe. There should not be live electrical wires running through them, and if there are, they should be clearly marked and protected and monitored. The fact that this hazard existed and killed someone represents a failure of the systems that are supposed to keep us safe. Someone, somewhere along the line, did not do their job properly, and the result was a man's death. I wonder sometimes if he had any warning, any sense in those final moments that something was wrong. Did he feel the electricity before he lost consciousness? Did he have time to be afraid? Or was it so fast that he did not suffer? These are questions that can never be answered, but they haunt me nonetheless. I hope that it was quick, that he did not have time to fully understand what was happening, that he did not experience prolonged pain or terror. The funeral would have been particularly difficult, I imagine, with people struggling to make sense of how someone who had survived so much could be taken so suddenly and in such a bizarre way. What do you say in a eulogy for someone whose death makes no sense? How do you find meaning or comfort when the circumstances are so random and preventable? The usual platitudes about everything happening for a reason, or it being their time to go, would have felt especially hollow and meaningless. 2 years later, our family continues to carry the weight of this loss and the disturbing knowledge of how he died. We share the story sometimes, not because we want to dwell on the tragedy, but because it seems important that people know about the hidden dangers that can exist in seemingly safe places. If his death can serve as a warning that saves someone else's life, if it can motivate better safety inspections and maintenance of electrical infrastructure near bodies of water, then perhaps some small meaning can be extracted from the senselessness of it all. But mostly, we just miss him and wish that he was still here. We wish that the electrical wire had not been there, or that he had chosen a different spot to fish that day, or that some small change in circumstances had resulted in a different outcome. We wish that beating cancer twice had earned him a long and peaceful retirement, filled with many more fishing trips that ended with him coming home safely to tell stories about the ones that got away. We wish that his death had made more sense, had been something we could understand and accept rather than this absurd and tragic accident that defies all logic and expectation. His story is a reminder that life is fragile and unpredictable, that survival in one context does not guarantee safety in another, and that we cannot always protect ourselves or the people we love from the random dangers that exist in the world. It is a sobering and frightening realization, but it is also one that makes us more grateful for the time we have and more determined to make the most of every ordinary day, because we never know which one might be our last. Story 10. In the mid-1970s, my dad was driving close to Chicago with my grandmother in the passenger seat, making what should have been a routine trip in an area they knew well. It was probably just an ordinary day, the kind where you get in the car to run errands or visit someone without giving much thought to potential dangers or the idea that this particular drive might turn into a story that would be told for decades to come. My dad was only 19 years old at the time, young and probably a bit cocky in the way that teenage boys often are when they are behind the wheel of a car. He had his whole life ahead of him, and he had no idea how close he came that day to having all of that taken away. Traffic around Chicago has always been challenging and unpredictable, with aggressive drivers and people who seem to think that the rules of the road do not apply to them. On this particular day, my dad encountered someone who was driving like an absolute maniac, weaving between lanes, going too fast, doing all the things that make other drivers nervous and angry. This person was creating a dangerous situation for everyone around them, and my dad made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. He cut the other driver off, probably to get away from them, or to assert his own space on the road, or simply out of frustration with their reckless behavior. But my dad, being 19 and full of teenage bravado, did not just cut the person off and leave it at that. He decided to make his feelings known by giving the other driver the finger, flipping them off in that universal gesture of anger and contempt that teenagers seem to specialize in. It was a moment of youthful defiance and poor judgment, the kind of thing that most of us have done at some point and then immediately regretted. In most cases, this kind of behavior just results in another angry driver or maybe some aggressive honking or return gestures. But in this case, the consequences of that middle finger could have been deadly. The other driver, instead of just getting angry and moving on or engaging in the typical road rage response, did something that immediately changed the nature of the situation. He identified himself as a cop and pulled my dad over. There were flashing lights, the authoritative presence of what appeared to be law enforcement, and the sinking feeling that comes with being pulled over by the police. My dad would have immediately felt a mix of emotions, probably some fear about what kind of trouble he was in, some embarrassment at being caught doing something stupid, and maybe some confusion about why a police officer had been driving so recklessly in the first place. When the man approached the car, he made a request that was highly unusual and should have immediately raised red flags about whether this was a legitimate traffic stop. He asked my dad for his entire wallet, not just his driver's license and registration like a normal cop would request, but the whole wallet with everything in it. This is not standard procedure for any police officer conducting a routine traffic stop. Cops ask to see your license, your registration, and your proof of insurance. They do not ask you to hand over your entire wallet with all your cash, credit cards, and personal items inside. My dad, probably intimidated by the authority figure and not thinking clearly because of stress and adrenaline, complied with the request. He handed over his wallet, giving this man access to all his identification, any money he had on him, and all the other contents that people typically carry in their wallets. My grandmother, sitting in the passenger seat and watching this interaction unfold, had the good sense to question what was happening. She was asking the man why he had pulled them over and why he needed the entire wallet. These were exactly the right questions to ask. The kind of challenges that might make a fake cop nervous or cause them to back down from whatever they were planning to do. The man took the wallet and looked through it, examining my dad's driver's license in particular. He read the information on the license, seeing my dad's name, his age, his address, and all the other details that are printed there. There was a pause, a moment where he seemed to be making some kind of decision or calculation in his head. Then he said something that has echoed through my family's memory for decades. He told my dad, "You're lucky you live in Niles," referring to the town in Illinois where my dad was from. The way he said it, the specific choice of words, suggested that living in Niles had somehow saved my dad from something terrible. What that something might have been was left unspoken. But the implication was clear and chilling. After making this statement, the man threw the wallet back at my dad and drove away. He did not write a ticket, did not give a warning, did not do any of the things that a real police officer would do after pulling someone over for a traffic violation. He just left, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as he had appeared. My dad and my grandmother were probably left sitting there in confusion, trying to process what had just happened and why it had been so strange. The encounter was unsettling enough that they remembered it clearly, but at the time they probably just chalked it up to a weird experience with a possibly corrupt cop or someone who was having a bad day. Life went on, and the incident faded into the background of daily existence, becoming just another story about a strange thing that happened once. My dad continued living his life, growing older, moving through his 20s and beyond. My grandmother went about her days as well, probably mentioning the weird traffic stop story occasionally but not dwelling on it too much. Years passed, and the mid-1970s became the late 1970s, and the world changed in countless ways, both large and small. Then one day, a few years after the traffic stop incident, my dad and my grandmother were watching television together when a news report came on that would transform their memory of that strange encounter from a curious anecdote into the stuff of nightmares. The police had arrested a man named John Wayne Gacy, and the details of his crimes were beginning to emerge in the media coverage. Gacy was not just any criminal. He was a serial killer who had been murdering young men in the Chicago area, luring them to his house and killing them in horrific ways. The bodies of his victims were being discovered buried in the crawl space under his house and in other locations around his property. As my dad and my grandmother watched the news coverage and saw John Wayne Gacy's face on the television screen, something clicked into place in my dad's memory. He recognized the man. The face that was now being shown as one of the most notorious serial killers in American history was the same face that had pulled him over years earlier, the same person who had claimed to be a cop and had asked for his entire wallet, the same individual who had told him he was lucky to live in Niles. The realization must have been absolutely shocking and terrifying. A sudden understanding that he had been face to face with a monster and had somehow escaped. My dad always says that when he looked into John Wayne Gacy's eyes during that traffic stop, he knew something was not right. There was something off about the man, something that did not fit with what a normal police officer should be like. Maybe it was the way he looked at my dad. Maybe it was the unusual request for the entire wallet. Maybe it was the strange comment about being lucky to live in Niles. Or maybe it was some indefinable quality in his eyes that spoke to the darkness inside him. Whatever it was, my dad's instincts had picked up on the fact that this was not a normal person and that something dangerous was happening. The more we know about John Wayne Gacy and his methods, the more terrifying this encounter becomes in retrospect. Gacy was known for presenting himself as a respectable member of the community, for using tricks and deception to gain people's trust and get them to lower their guard. He had worked as a contractor and had been involved in local politics and community events. He performed as a clown at children's parties and charitable events, creating a public persona that was friendly and harmless. But beneath that facade was a predator who targeted young men and boys, luring them with promises of work or other enticements, and then torturing and murdering them. One of Gacy's known tactics was to impersonate a police officer to gain control over his victims or to approach them without raising suspicion. He had handcuffs and other police equipment that he used as part of his ruse, making his victims believe that they were being detained by law enforcement and therefore had to comply with his demands. The fact that he pulled my dad over while posing as a cop fits perfectly with his known patterns of behavior and shows just how calculated and practiced his deceptions were. The statement that my dad was lucky to live in Niles takes on an especially dark meaning when you consider what Gacy might have been planning. Gacy's victims were typically young men, and my dad, at 19 years old, would have fit the profile perfectly. The fact that Gacy looked at the license, saw where my dad lived, and then decided to let him go suggests that there was something about living in Niles that made my dad too risky as a potential victim. Maybe Niles was too close to where Gacy lived or operated, making it more likely that my dad's disappearance would be investigated seriously. Maybe Gacy had some connection to Niles that made him worry about being recognized or traced. Or maybe he had already killed someone from that area and did not want to draw attention by taking multiple victims from the same town. Whatever the reason, that detail on my dad's driver's license saved his life. If my dad had lived in a different town, if his address had been somewhere else, he might have become one of Gacy's victims that day. Instead of living to tell this story and to become my father and to have children and grandchildren, he might have ended up buried in Gacy's crawl space or disposed of in some other terrible way. The randomness of this survival, the fact that it came down to something as arbitrary as which town his family happened to live in, is almost too disturbing to fully process. My grandmother's presence in the car might also have been a factor in saving my dad's life. Gacy typically targeted young men who were alone, vulnerable, and unlikely to be immediately missed. Having a witness in the car, especially an older woman who was asking questions and might remember details, would have made it much more difficult for Gacy to proceed with whatever he had been planning. My grandmother's questions about why they were being pulled over and why the wallet was needed were not just good instincts but potentially life-saving interventions that disrupted Gacy's routine and made my dad a less appealing target. The fact that this encounter happened in the mid-1970s, years before Gacy was caught in 1978, means that my dad crossed paths with him while he was actively killing people. This was not an encounter with someone who had committed crimes in the distant past and was now reformed or in prison. This was meeting a serial killer during his most active period, when he was regularly luring and murdering young men and disposing of their bodies. The danger was real and immediate, and only a combination of luck, my grandmother's presence, and the detail about where my dad lived prevented him from becoming another statistic in one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history. When Gacy was finally caught and the full extent of his crimes became public, the nation was horrified by the details. He had killed at least 33 young men and boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. The bodies found in his crawl space revealed years of murder that had gone undetected while Gacy lived what appeared to be a normal, even exemplary life in his community. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions was shocking and forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters can hide in plain sight, looking and acting like ordinary people, even while committing unspeakable atrocities. For my dad, learning that the strange cop who had pulled him over was actually John Wayne Gacy must have been a moment of overwhelming emotion. There would have been fear and horror at realizing how close he had come to being killed. Gratitude for whatever circumstances had allowed him to escape, and probably a sense of survivor's guilt, knowing that other young men who had similar encounters did not make it out alive. The fact that he can still remember looking into Gacy's eyes and sensing that something was wrong shows how impactful and frightening the encounter was, even before he knew the full truth about who the man really was. This story has been passed down in our family as both a warning and a reminder of how fragile life can be and how close we can come to disaster without even realizing it. It is a story about trusting your instincts when something feels off, about the importance of having someone else with you who can ask questions and be a witness, and about the role that pure chance and random details can play in determining whether we live or die. The fact that my dad is alive to tell this story, and that I exist because he survived that encounter, makes the whole thing feel even more significant and meaningful to our family. My dad's experience also adds to the larger story of John Wayne Gacy and helps us understand how he was able to operate for so long without being caught. He was skilled at reading situations, at identifying vulnerable targets, and at backing off when circumstances were not ideal for him to proceed. The fact that he let my dad go rather than trying to force the situation shows that he was calculating and careful, qualities that allowed him to continue killing for years without raising the kind of suspicions that would have led to his capture. When I hear this story, I am struck by how many small details had to align for my dad to survive. If my grandmother had not been in the car, if my dad had lived in a different town, if he had not given Gacy the finger and prompted the traffic stop in the first place, or if any number of other small factors had been different, the outcome could have been completely different. Life contains these moments where we unknowingly stand at a crossroads between survival and death, and we only realize later how close we came to taking the wrong path. The story also makes me think about all the other people who might have had similar encounters with Gacy and escaped without knowing how lucky they were. There were probably others who were pulled over by him while he was impersonating a cop, or who were approached by him in other contexts, but for whatever reason did not become victims. Some of them might not even remember the encounter, or might not have recognized him when he was arrested years later. My dad was fortunate enough to be watching television with my grandmother when the news about Gacy's arrest came on, allowing him to make the connection and understand the true nature of what had happened to him. Even now, decades after the encounter and long after Gacy was executed for his crimes, my dad still talks about looking into his eyes and knowing something was wrong. That instinctive sense of danger, that feeling that something about this person was off, even though he could not have known specifically what it was, may have saved his life by making him more cautious or by influencing how he responded to the situation. We should all be so lucky as to have our instincts work that well when we need them most. The story of my dad's encounter with John Wayne Gacy is a reminder that evil exists in the world and that sometimes we come into contact with it without even realizing what we are dealing with until much later. It is a story about survival and luck and the thin line that separates those who make it home safely from those who do not. And it is a story that our family will continue to tell for generations, both as a piece of our personal history and as a testament to how precious and precarious life can be. It has been 9 years since that weekend, but the memory of it is as sharp and cold as a winter morning. When you are young, you think the world is built for your amusement. You think that music festivals, with their loud bass, bright lights, and sea of people, are safe bubbles where reality can't touch you. I was at one of those festivals with my friends. It wasn't one of the glamorous high-end ones you see on Instagram. It was a bit grittier, a bit messier, the kind of place where the music is good, but the organization is chaotic and the surrounding area is a little rough around the edges. We were having the time of our lives, completely unaware that we were dancing just a few hundred meters away from a nightmare. It was the second day of the festival, a Saturday, and the energy was frantic. We had spent the entire day jumping, drinking, and losing ourselves in the crowd. By the time the headliners finished and the after-hours sets began to wind down, we were exhausted. It was around 4 or 5 in the morning. That strange time of day where it isn't quite night anymore, but the sun hasn't fully risen. The sky was a bruised purple and gray, bleeding into the horizon. The air was damp and cold, a stark contrast to the sweaty heat of the mosh pits we had been in hours earlier. There were 4 of us in our little group. Me, my best male mate, and 2 of our close female friends. We had rented a flat nearby to save money on the expensive on-site camping. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 minutes or so, but it took us away from the main festival grounds and through a quieter, more desolate area. We decided to walk back instead of waiting for a cab because the lines were insane and we just wanted to crash. We stumbled out of the festival gates, ears still ringing, laughing about something stupid that had happened during the concert. The walk home felt entirely uneventful at the time. We walked down a long stretch of road that was lined with overgrown grass and drainage ditches on either side. It was the kind of road that feels lonely, even in the middle of the day, but at that hour, under the gray dawn light, it was desolate. We were the only ones walking in that direction. I remember feeling a sense of relief that we were together. We were a pack. I remember looking at the silhouette of the trees and the dark water in the drainage channels and thinking nothing of it other than it looked a bit bleak. We made it to our rented flat, unlocked the door, and collapsed into our beds, passing out almost immediately. We felt safe. We had no idea how close we had just walked to a crime scene. We woke up a few hours later, around noon on Sunday. The plan was to grab some food, shower, and head back for the final day of the festival. But as soon as we stepped outside, the atmosphere had shifted. The festival vibe, that carefree, chaotic energy, was gone. It had been replaced by something heavy and tense. The first thing we noticed was the noise, or rather the lack of music and the abundance of sirens. We walked down the street to get coffee and saw police patrols everywhere. It wasn't just a couple of officers directing traffic, it was a swarm. There were marked cars, unmarked vans, and officers on foot combing the area. We tried to walk toward the main road, the same one we had walked down just a few hours prior, but it was blocked off with police tape. Blue lights were flashing against the daylight, looking jarring and out of place. We were confused. For the previous 2 days, the police presence had been minimal, mostly just security guards checking bags. Now it looked like a war zone. We tried to ask a passerby what was going on, but nobody really knew. Rumors were flying. Some said it was a drug bust. Others said a fight had broken out. As we tried to navigate around the blockade to get to the festival entrance, we were stopped by a patrol. The officers weren't friendly. They were serious, on edge. They stopped the 4 of us and demanded to see our IDs. They asked us where we were staying, where we had been the night before, and specifically, what time we had walked home. When we told them we walked back between 4 and 5 in the morning, the officer's face hardened. He wrote down our names and told us to stay out of the taped-off area. It was unnerving. We felt like suspects even though we hadn't done anything. We eventually made it into the festival, but the mood was dead. The news started to trickle in slowly, whisper by whisper, until the full, horrifying truth was revealed. It occurred that on Saturday night, or rather Sunday morning, at around 3 o'clock, a woman had been brutally murdered. The timeline was what made my stomach drop. We had walked down that exact road past that exact spot barely an hour or two after it happened. The woman had been at the festival just like us. She was there with a group of friends and her husband. They were having a good time just like we were. But at some point in the night, she started to feel ill. Maybe it was something she ate, maybe she had too much to drink, or maybe she was just exhausted. She told her husband she wanted to go home. He offered to go with her, but she insisted he stay and enjoy the rest of the night. She said she would be fine. It was a short walk. She left the safety of the crowd and began the walk back to her accommodation alone. She never made it. Somewhere along that dark, lonely road, the same road my friends and I had laughed and stumbled down, someone was waiting, or maybe someone followed her. The police report said she was grabbed on her way home. The details that came out later were the stuff of nightmares. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong, and it wasn't a quick attack. It was prolonged and brutal. The attacker had dragged her off the road. They found her body in one of the drainage channels that ran alongside the street. The condition of her body was what shocked the entire community. She was found completely naked. Her clothes had been ripped from her. Naturally, the first assumption everyone made was that she had been sexually assaulted, but the autopsy revealed that there were no signs of rape. This detail somehow made it even scarier. It meant the motive wasn't sexual gratification in the traditional sense. It was pure violence. It was rage. Someone had stripped her, terrified her, and then unleashed a storm of brutality upon her. She had been beaten severely. The medical examiner found extensive bruising and trauma. After beating her, the killer had choked her, squeezing the life out of her throat. But the final cause of death wasn't the beating or the strangulation. It was the water. After battering her and stripping her of her dignity, the killer had thrown her into the drainage channel. She was likely unconscious or too weak to fight back. She drowned in the murky, cold water of that ditch, alone in the dark, just a few hundred meters from where thousands of people were dancing to loud music. Her body was discovered later that morning, likely around the time we were waking up. When we put the pieces together, the realization hit us like a physical blow. The murder happened around 3 a.m. We walked past that spot between 4 and 5 a.m. That means her body was lying in that ditch, just a few feet away from us, as we walked home. It means the killer might have still been there. He could have been hiding in the tall grass, watching us pass. He could have been washing the blood off his hands in the water while we joked about the concert. The road was dark. We wouldn't have seen him if he was crouching down. The proximity was terrifying. The crime scene was only 200 to 500 meters from our path. If we had left the festival an hour earlier, we might have seen it happening. We might have heard her screams, or terrifyingly, we might have walked right into the killer while he was in the middle of the act. If my 2 female friends had decided to leave early on their own, just like that poor woman did, they could have been the victims. It was a game of chance, a roll of the dice that we survived, and she didn't. The investigation went on for months. The police combed the area, interviewed hundreds of festival goers, and checked CCTV from the surrounding businesses. But the location was rural enough that there were no cameras on that specific stretch of road. The DNA evidence, if there was any, washed away in the drainage channel or didn't match anyone in the system. The murderer was never found. To this day, 9 years later, it remains a cold case. Someone got away with beating and drowning a woman for no apparent reason and then vanished into the night. It was very sad and scary, especially knowing that it happened in such a tight time frame. The randomness of it is what haunts me. She wasn't targeted because of who she was. She was targeted because she was alone. If she had walked with someone, if her husband had insisted on going with her, this probably would never have happened. The predator saw an opportunity, a lone woman on a dark road, and took it. That weekend changed the way I look at the world. It stripped away that feeling of invincibility. I realized that safety is just an illusion we create for ourselves. Since then, I have become extremely protective of my friends. I always make sure that my female friends never go home alone. I don't care if it's a 5-minute walk. I don't care if they say they are fine. I walk them to their door, or I put them in a verified